Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when and where you're watching. This is Lesson 26, the European Union, Part 1. Um, when I chose the idea of using the European Union as sort of our way of looking at everything that happens in Europe since World War II, I realize I'm leaving a lot out. Since you've read the European Union book, I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on context in this lesson to try to get everything into place. But obviously, we're talking about point in time that stretches back to 1945. A lot has happened in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, in terms of society, in terms of culture. Europe is a very different place than it was, that long ago, 1945. So, a lot to talk about, but we'll see how it goes. If you're following along with the slides, I'll let you know when I'm switching over. On administrative notes, just an exciting opportunity if you happen to be watching this on Thursday. History Colorado is moving some of its events online, and one of the first coming up is a talk by Dr. Karen Roybal of Colorado College up in Colorado Springs on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's free. It's a Zoom. I think it's Zoom. Anyway, it's free. It's remote. But you do need to register, so I've included the link on the course administration slide. I'll emphasize again that course feedback is open and available to you, and it's really important to me. I really do pay close attention to it. This class is not the same as it was in spring of 2018 when I taught it because of that feedback, and I hope to keep improving as a teacher, and so I need your comments to do that. What's going right? What's going wrong? Be sending out an invitation shortly, sometime later this week or weekend, depending on how things go schedule-wise, for an entirely optional Zoom session during our scheduled final exam period. So 10:30 to 12:50 Mountain Daylight Time on Tuesday, the 28th of April. Just to get together, look at our posters, and say a fond farewell to History 352 and each other. Due dates for papers. Not the semester we ordered, was it? So keep doing your best to get it in. Please remember to turn in all papers, if at all possible, via Blackboard. Excuse me, that will enable me to grade them and get them back to you that much quicker. Once I'm completely caught up with both my classes on everything that's come in via Blackboard, I will start going back through my email and finding those papers that some of you have turned in late, which is fine. We've talked about it, no problem, but it's taking me a little bit to catch up. Other than that, nothing new there. We'll move on to the jobs. Never worked in NGIA or NGIA. It used to be NGIS. Now it's NGIA. But I do know people who do, and they love it. It's a really exciting job. And it's a good example of the many, many intelligence careers that are open to people with our background. Even something that you would think of as highly technical, like photo interpretation. They'll teach you that part. What they need is your analytical mind and your critical thinking, which history has helped develop in you. So, not a bad starting job as an analyst there. The few different locations where you could work. Not bad. Okay. Writing tip of the day. Semicolons. Semicolons actually do something other than create emojis. Hopefully you'll use both of them in your writing at various points, but the one important way they're used is to clarify lists. We usually use commas to separate items in lists, but when elements within a list are also separated by commas, it can become quite confusing. So the list I've provided you here uses semicolons to separate the various locations, because grammatically you're required to put a comma between the city or region and country. So you have London, comma, UK, semicolon, letting you know that there's a break in the list at that point. Another is to unite two united. Wow, and I put that up there. Okay, let's talk about proofreading, right? We all make mistakes. I'll go back and fix it. to unite two complete clauses into a single sentence. That means that each part has to be able to stand on its own. So if you look at that first sentence there, few expected any member of the EU to ever attempt to leave. Brexit changed that understanding forever. Both parts are sentences by themselves. You could put a period between them after leave, before Brexit, and you would be just fine. But the advantage of using a semicolon to connect them is to emphasize their close relationship to each other. That these are two sentences or two clauses that are very, very tightly associated, and specifically very powerful when focusing attention on a contrast or a contradiction. And I think you see how it works in that sentence. All right. Moving on to questions, I do look forward to seeing your questions and answering them in the discussion board. And remember, you don't have to start a new thread if you want to respond to something I've already responded to, or if you want to add something to a question somebody else has asked. That is perfectly acceptable. That is just fine. Go ahead and do that. Also remember that the discussion boards for past lessons do remain open, and I am monitoring them. So if you missed a past lesson and you want to go back and ask your question and add to the discussion there, I will keep up with it. And I encourage everybody else to as well. Look back at those discussion boards and see what's new. All right. So let's talk about the European Union. And let's talk about the whole idea of European integration. Europe is actually the place where we get our modern state system, which is sometimes called the Westphalian system after the Treaty of Westphalia, which established the essentials of our idea of state sovereignty. Sovereignty is a challenging concept sometimes, but the essentials are pretty simple. There are internal and external components. The internal components mean or wrapped around the idea of the state having control of certain key aspects of society, specifically the power to legislate, to establish what the rules are for that society, the power to tax, and a monopoly of legitimate violence, meaning only the state, only the sovereign state can raise an army, declare war, declare peace, or to use violence as part of the judicial process, whether that's using violence or the threat of violence to apprehend lawbreakers, or up to and including capital punishment. So those are elements of internal sovereignty. External means that there is no authority outside of the state that can give direction to it. So there's no higher authority that can be appealed to. And so sovereignties are a really important concept, and in the European state system, the Westphalian state system that has spread around the world, states are sovereign. There are no governments above them, and they all, at least in theory, control those internal elements of legislation, taxation, and the monopoly of violence. Now, some states, like our own United States, operate on a federal system, meaning that there is some level of sharing of governmental power at various levels. In the United States, we have federal and we have state, and then within states we have local and county governments and those sorts of things. But the United States remains sovereign because there's no authority above it. Now, the U.S. is a member of the United Nations and various other organizations, but those are voluntary associations between governments, not a supra-state organization. Excuse me. Pardon me. And no, I'm not going to start over and record another 10 minutes just because I sneezed. Okay. So with that idea of sovereignty in mind, we then have to address the question of what's happened in Europe since World War II as intergovernmental, i.e. something that is happening between governments, between sovereign states, or is it federal, i.e. is the relationship of the states in the EU as it develops, is that somehow similar to what we have in the United States, where ultimately the EU is going to assume the aspects of sovereignty? And the answer is, well, of course, yes, just like all other easy questions. There are definitely strong elements, as you picked up from your reading from the Usherwood and Pinder book on the European Union, elements of both. Some aspects of the EU are definitely intergovernmental. Other aspects seem much more federal, in that the EU actually has authority over the governments that make it up, and that's kind of weird. But as you know, I'm kind of fascinated by forms of government. We've talked a lot about empires. We moved on to the idea of the nation and the nation state. And now we have something that doesn't seem to fit the patterns that we've had in the past. Maybe it is indeed actually something entirely new in governmental structure and governmental history. So to start to figure that out, go ahead and take a look at the video, The Rise of the EU. It's a very good overview of the important milestones on the creation, development, expansion, and deepening of the EU, and try to relate it to what you read with Underwood and Pinder, especially in terms of the ideas of both intergovernmental operations and federal operations. And an entire aside, you'll also note that the video is produced by Viking Cruise Lines, and I just want to point out that that's an aspect of potential employment for historians that we sometimes overlook. The travel and tourism industry, historical background to become a guide, to design those kinds of videos, to write those scripts. That's important. Maybe you don't get to be the presenter on camera. Maybe they just hire a talking head for that. But somebody did that. Somebody put that together, and you could be that somebody. All right, go ahead and watch The Rise of the EU, and come on back. All right, welcome back. So we've hit the kind of the highlights there of the various treaties and all, but I'd like to contextualize a little bit about that. Europeans in general, no matter what side they'd been on, no matter the experience of their country occupied or not, came back with one common understanding of World War II, and that was, let's not do that again. That was a really, really bad idea. So pretty much all of European political and a lot of its economic history, starting in 1945 and moving forward, is predicated on the idea of not having World War II again. Now, it's very easy for us in the 21st century to look back and kind of miss that fact, or to over-assign value to the Cold War. We'll talk about that in a moment. But because we know the Cold War becomes sort of the dominant motif of the entire late 20th century, for the people living at that time, that's not necessarily the case. The most important experience of their lives had been the Second World War and the devastation it wrought on Europe. So there's a great deal of, let's not do that again. Now, there's also a great deal of disagreement as to how to not do that again. But if we keep in mind that avoiding another intra-European war, another war between European governments, is the guiding principle of many, if not most, of the statesmen of the era, then we can understand what's going on a little better. It's also worth understanding that Europe is a very different place in 1945 than it had been in 1938. It is a poorer place. It is a less populous place. It is a place with much less stuff of any sort. The infrastructure is ruined in many places. Farmland has been destroyed. Industry has been destroyed. Transportation networks are in ruins. And governments have been widely discredited, either because they were on the losing side of the war or because they lost to the initial losing side and had suffered through occupation. So keeping that all in mind, we can now turn toward the Cold War. And what's really important, well, I keep saying that, but it is really important to understand that the Cold War is kind of a weird experience for Europe because they're not at the center of it. Ever since the 16th, 17th century, and then on especially into the 18th and 19th with the development of global European colonial empires, Europe has literally been at the center of the map. Europe has been the dominant force. Now, we all know that empires don't go quite as deep as we sometimes assume they do. Just because a place is colored the home country's color on the map doesn't mean that its society has been changed a whole lot. But nevertheless, the European great powers have been calling the shots for an extended period of time, certainly for the lifetime of anybody who's alive in 1945. And that's kind of a big deal because now that's not the case. Europe is actually now going to be dominated by its peripheries, by Russia in the form of the Soviet Union that has long been sort of on the edge of Europe, sometimes part of Europe, sometimes not, looking to Europe for inspiration, but also disparaging Europe as not as good as Holy Mother Russia. And the United States, the sort of this upstart teenager of a country from across the Atlantic that grew out of European colonialism but took its own direction. So, with the shots in Europe largely being called by Americans and Soviets, this is going to be a very different sort of experience. The countries that are occupied by the Red Army, by the Soviet Union during World War II, countries like Poland, the eastern part of Germany, large parts of Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, these countries are forced into communist governments. It's not an immediate process, but it happens. These countries are forced to adopt communism, and it's worth saying that at least initially there was a fair amount of enthusiasm for communism in at least some parts of Eastern Europe. Again, what's the most important experience of their lives? World War II. And World War II discredited many of their pre-war governments to the point where people would say, well, hey, why not give this a try? Could it possibly turn out worse than our previous governments? And in many cases, despite the horrors of Soviet repression in Eastern Europe, the answer is no, it wasn't nearly as bad as fascism had been. So, better at least than the World War II experience. So we have this because the Red Army, the Soviet Union establishes its form of government wherever the Red Army held sway, and arguably the United States and Great Britain did so in the places where their armies held sway in Western Europe. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill refers to it, descends across Europe. So we now have a division. Which parts of Europe are looking towards and being guided by one part of the periphery, the United States, and which are being guided by and looking to the other part, the Soviet Union. That's weird for Europe because Central Europe has kind of been its own cultural entity for a while. We talked about the Habsburgs. You'll notice that the Habsburg Empire is divided. Germany is divided. All of the states and organizations of Central Europe are being reformed, not necessarily for the better, but being reformed by this division. We also begin to see a lot of economic and social divergence based on the Marshall Plan. When the United States starts providing massive economic aid to those countries that will accept it and, not coincidentally, accept the rules that go with it, things like greater economic cooperation and integration, and most of all, essentially opening up their account books and letting the Marshall Plan administrators, aka Americans, know what's really going on with the economy. Some countries didn't have any problem with that at all, especially if they thought opening up their books would get them more. But for the Soviet Union, even though it was offered Marshall Plan assistance, that is absolutely off the table because Stalin does not want anyone in the world to know just how devastated the Soviet Union was by World War II, just how horrible the casualties were and how awful the material destruction had been. He feels that admitting that would make him vulnerable and make the Soviet Union vulnerable. So the Soviet Union's out and it forces its satellite states not to participate in the Marshall Plan. So the difference between those Marshall Plan states and the non-Marshall Plan states begins to emerge as well. And of course, that line is pretty close to the Iron Curtain. But where the Iron Curtain was about establishing governments, the Marshall Plan is about establishing economic recovery. And the form of economic recovery that takes place in Western Europe, where capitalism is built up in order to make Europe a reasonably good trading partner for the United States, is very different from what happens on the Soviet side of the line of the Iron Curtain, where the Eastern European economies are forced to industrialize on the Soviet model, meaning an emphasis on primary products and heavy industry, so a lot of coal production, a lot of steel production, a lot of metallurgy, not a lot of consumer goods, but also they're forced into very unequal trade treaties with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union is essentially, without actually stealing, is actually stealing from all of the Eastern European countries. This division is played out militarily with the establishment first of NATO and then of the Warsaw Pact. And these are significant in and of themselves as well, because they speak to a much greater military cooperation between the member states. Now, NATO is dominated by the United States, with the Warsaw Pact is dominated by the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, we're looking at a degree of military integration that's simply not heard of prior to World War II. It just doesn't happen. The idea of having combined staffs, so military officers from various countries working together on planning, integrated military forces, integrated military plans. It's an experience that is important, in a sense, psychologically. This idea of working together in various ways becomes more or less second nature for many Europeans, especially for European elites or European governmental figures. They spend time in the military working together. They spend time working Marshall Plan administration, working together, or on the other side in Comic-Con. But the point there is that more and more Europeans are becoming accustomed to working together much more tightly than would have been possible before World War II. At the same time all of this is going on, the great European empires, the great imperial states like Britain, especially like France, Belgium, remember them, Italy, all of these countries, either as a result of World War II or immediately after, begin to give up their colonial empires, or at least the greater portion of them. Give up is probably a stretch terminology. Sometimes they fight very, very bloody wars in an effort to hang on to their colonial empires. But the reality is Europeans simply lack the strength and the will to maintain global empires after World War II. And again, we go back to the centrality of that World War II experience. So the British Empire ceases to be the British Empire, unless you count places like the Falklands and the British Indian Ocean territories and some other spots and bits. The French give up the vast majority of their empire, some very bloody fighting in Indochina, some very bloody fighting in Algeria, but all in all, the Europeans are forced to recognize that they no longer have the ability to maintain those colonial empires, and they don't want to in many ways. World War II and the experience of it led to a sort of crisis of confidence in Europeans. If the 19th century imperialism is all about helping the lesser peoples of the world to someday aspire to European standards, if you look at World War II, do European standards really look like something somebody should be aspiring to? I'm going to go with no on that one. Is European civilization truly the most advanced in the world? Well, look at the Holocaust. Look at the bombing of civilian targets. Look at the horrors of the war. And to say that this is a civilization that the rest of the world should be emulating is just not something that can be done anymore. So you've read the book, you've seen the video, so you understand something about the rise of the EU. As the Cold War draws to an end, it begins to open up some more space. Essentially, the Soviet Union collapses. If you're really interested in that, I recommend our Russian history course, History 362, which will be taught again in, let's see, fall of 2021. For those of you who will still be around, it's a great course. At least I think it's a great course because it's my course. But I digress. The point here is that, and I did have one, that with the Soviet Union unable to impose its will on Eastern Europe, those countries become free to make their own choices, and as you recognize now, for many of them, becoming more greatly integrated into the European Union and into Central and Western Europe is high on their list of things to do. But also the United States, without the bipolar world sort of paradigm defining a lot of what the United States does, the United States becomes less interested in Europe in many ways. Certainly to the point of not wanting to spend nearly as much money defending it. And so with the two peripheral states, the Soviet Union disintegrating to be replaced by the Russian Federation, which will be back and will be a threat, thank you, Putin. And also the United States sort of looking to be, well, on one hand, maybe a unipolar world power, but also looking to cut expenses after the Cold War. This opens up space for Europeans to once again begin to assert their own and pursue their own destiny. And interestingly, almost universally, the idea that sticks most in their minds is to more greatly unify Europe, to add more countries to the European Union, to expand the level, the breadth and depth of the European Union, and the breadth and depth of integration of European societies. Again, the World War II generation is still with us at that point, and the recognition of all the terrible things that happened there mean that even if the United States and the Soviet Union are not going to be the peripheral powers coming in and enforcing discipline on their respective alliances, doesn't mean that Europeans want to go back to unrestricted state sovereignty, want to go back to a purely Westphalian system, because that just worked out so well in the 1930s and 1940s. So the European Union expands, it adds new members, it adds new functions, and again, Pinder and Usherwood do a great job of walking you through a lot of that. But at the same time, we begin to see greater resistance to the EU. Now, it's not like the EU had this entirely smooth sailing from its founding to today. People like Charles de Gaulle and Margaret Thatcher, very similar personalities in a sense, were very concerned about the idea of state sovereignty. For Charles de Gaulle, it was the greatness of France. For Britain, it is the independence of the United Kingdom and the special relationship with the United States. In both cases of these leaders and other leaders, but they're two good examples, they begin to question at various points the utility of parts of the European Union. Charles de Gaulle in the 1950s, 1960s, Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. So this sort of questioning and resistance to the further expansion or deepening of the EU's authority is not an unreal thing, even that far back. But overall, the trend has generally been towards greater integration, expanded membership, more functions, more responsibility taken over by the EU, and going back to where we kind of started, more federal kinds of functions with the EU functioning as an actual government, and less emphasis on many of the intergovernmental functions. But again, always a mix, never all one or all the other. So despite opposition, despite some doubts about the utility of the EU, or at least the utility of all aspects of the EU, the thing continues to hum along until we really hit the Eurozone crisis. Now, you'll recall from your reading the video the idea of the euro as a common currency to help bind the European Union together. Again, even at its height, the euro did not attract every member of the European Union. 19 of the current 27 members, 19 of 28 when Britain was a member, use the euro. The others continue to use national currencies. But aspiring to be part of the Eurozone had really seemed like an excellent idea for a long time. But the Eurozone crisis began to expose some of the underlying challenges to the EU. What I mean by that is that while we think of the EU as a single entity, in some cases, and at least in terms of the euro, it turns out there are actually some substantial differences. The biggest problem with a single currency was that the various states that were part of the Eurozone, that are part of the Eurozone, have given up the ability to manage or to manipulate their own currency to their own advantage. So weaker economies cannot devalue their currency in order to make their exports more attractive. And that's kind of a problem. But at the same time, the stronger economies of Europe, especially Germany, also are running into trouble. The German economy is essentially a very export-driven economy. The production of German industrial and manufactured goods and selling them to other countries, whether they're inside the EU or outside the EU, is the fundamental part of the German economy. And but in order for them to do that, they need willing and able customers. And when the sovereign debt issue began to become more and more important in some of the poorer economies, often referred to as the European South, places like Spain, Italy, especially Greece, and they lacked the ability to float their currency, an individual national currency. It led to an increasing cycle of problems because the wealthier economies within the EU kept saying to the poorer economies, well, you just got to be more disciplined. Okay, you just got to cut your debt, so cut government services and cut pensions and things like that, which really did not excite the citizens of the countries that were involved in this. And many began to argue that being part of the Eurozone wasn't such a good idea after all, or at the very least, other countries other than the more powerful economies like Germany needed much more of a say in what the Eurozone was all about. So as these doubts led some people to say, well, the European Union's going to collapse. Other people to say, no, the European Union will get through. It nevertheless kind of shook the fundamental assumption, at least on the part of many, especially many federalists, people who believe that Europe would, could, and should evolve towards a more federal system with the EU serving more and more governmental functions, really shook their confidence in a lot of ways. This is also the point, or shortly thereafter, when for the first time a country attempted to leave the European Union. And there's a short video. This is by no means a balanced account of the reasoning for the for Britain's effort to leave the EU, but it certainly, I think, is a heartfelt explanation thereof. So go ahead and take a look at that and then bounce on back. All right, it's a fun video. He's a great speaker. You don't have to agree with him to recognize just how effective he is at getting his point across. As I said, it's pretty one-sided. But on the other hand, it explains why many in the UK decided that, yes, it was time to depart the European Union. What we've discovered since the video was made, since the British made the decision to leave, if you've been watching the news, is that's really a difficult thing to do. And that has a lot to do with the intergovernmental and federal natures of the EU. The EU had succeeded in doing what it was supposed to do, to more tightly bind the states of Europe together, to integrate them in ways that would make a war impossible. Remember, it all goes back to that experience of World War II. So as that has happened, Britain is trying desperately to extricate itself, successfully or not, we'll see. When I first taught this lesson in 2018, I figured certainly the next time I teach this course we'll have a definitive answer. Not so much. We'll see how that goes. Nobody's really talking about Brexit anymore in the wake of coronavirus, but we'll also have to see how that plays out. So that brings the lesson to a somewhat unsatisfactory conclusion. Just for your reference, I did provide you a list of the EU official languages. Try to keep that all straight. And a map of the EU, I had to update this. Oh my, it should say 2020, because if it was 2018, the UK would still be there. Okay, I'm not redoing 35 minutes of video to fix my slides, but it just goes to show that we're all getting a little fatigued at the end of the semester. Sorry about that. That should be the EU as of 2020. Okay, so conclusions. The bottom line is the destruction of two world wars, especially World War II, the beginning of the end of European global empires, decolonization, and the bipolar Cold War made the mid-20th century the moment for Europe to reconsider the state system. The Westphalian system of sovereign states had not necessarily worked out to the advantage of many Europeans. So the gradual expansion of the EU and its predecessors, which you went over in the book and the video, in both its competencies and its membership, garnered wide support. But there was resistance to both the general idea of unity, people who wanted to emphasize the sovereignty of their particular state, and to specific aspects of the EU developed early, and they remained strong. Perhaps strong enough to stop EU expansion in at least some areas. We'll see what happens. If you're interested, William Hitchcock's The Bitter Road to Freedom, A New History of the Liberation of Europe, is an excellent work that talks about just how awful things were in late World War II and immediately after in Europe. We tend to look at VE Day as liberation and yay, concentration camps are closed, everybody's happy, we win, they lose. But putting the continent back together is a much more complicated thing than that. The experience of being liberated, sometimes being bombed and shelled to freedom, is not necessarily always a pleasant one. And there's a lot of work to be done to rebuild the continent. Kagan's Of Paradise and Power is an interesting essay, because one of the things that the EU doesn't seem to be all that interested in is exercising that aspect of sovereignty that we kind of assume is part of it, i.e. raising militaries and going to war. There's a little bit about that in the EU, and there's a little bit about it in the Usherwood and Pinder book, but it's kind of an oddity. So Kagan's essay comparing America and Europe in the wake of the Cold War is a very thought-provoking piece. And finally, Odd Arne Wested's The Cold War, World History, is probably the best single volume out there on the Cold War. Now, as it is a world history, it decenters Europe in some ways than more traditional Cold War scholarship would. So, perhaps it's not entirely appropriate for a European history course per se, but it really does contextualize the experience of Europeans in the Cold War along with everybody else in the world. Vested is a Norwegian historian, so he does have his own perspective too. All right, well, I hope you and yours are staying safe and healthy. Keep an eye on our directives from our first responders, from our medical professionals, our public health professionals. Do everything you can to stay safe and healthy. If you've got questions, contact me. I'm happy to help. And above all, don't panic. Talk to you later.